the escape that should have been impossible. Before we get into today's case, hit subscribe. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a prison escape, it's a blueprint of manipulation, betrayal, and a system that never thought it could break. And trust me, by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why this story shook America. The sirens began before sunrise. A chill rolled over the quiet town of Dannemora, New York, as lights from Clinton Correctional Facility flickered through the early morning fog. Officers paced along the outer gate, confused, tense, checking and rechecking something they couldn't yet believe. 2 inmates, Richard Matt and David Sweat, were missing. And not missing in the usual sense. Not hidden in laundry carts. Not tucked behind equipment or lost in paperwork. They were gone. Vanished. Vanished from a maximum security prison that, until that morning, had been considered escape-proof. A place where some of the state's most dangerous offenders lived their lives behind towering walls, razor wire, and constant surveillance. A place where even the thought of escape was considered fiction. But the hole they left behind was real. A chunk of pipe sliced open. A wall cut cleanly. Dark tunnels stretching deep below the prison like the veins of an old machine. Every step the investigators took echoed with the same unsettling question. How did 2 inmates outsmart all of this? Detective Sarah Monroe, leading the early investigation, ran her flashlight along the steel, scanning the neat edges of the opening. Tools, she murmured. They had tools. Real ones. Someone helped them. Because this wasn't the work of improvisation. This was calculated, practiced, almost surgical. And the deeper they walked, the worse it became. Hidden passageways. Old maintenance tunnels. Grates loosened days earlier. Planning that clearly had taken months. Sweat and Matt hadn't just escaped. They had mapped the prison like architects. But the first real shock didn't come from the tunnels. It came from the inmate work area, where officers found an empty sewing station and a half-finished stack of uniforms. Someone had been missing from her post, or rather, avoiding it. Joyce Mitchell, a middle-aged prison employee who worked closely with both inmates. Friendly, helpful, trusted, the kind of person no one ever looked at twice. But as investigators flipped through logs, checked surveillance, and listened to whispers from other inmates, a pattern appeared, one that made the officers' faces stiffen. Joyce had been spending more time around Sweat and Matt than any employee should. Conversations that ran too long. Favors granted too easily. Rules bent just enough to go unnoticed. And then there were the late-night shifts she volunteered for, the ones that no one questioned until now. Detective Monroe stared at Joyce's personnel file. 2 inmates don't get power tools, uniforms, maps, and a head start without someone on the inside. But before they could question her, Joyce arrived at work trembling, pale, and visibly shaking. She didn't even reach her workstation before collapsing onto a bench, mumbling that she came to turn herself in. Turn herself in for what? That question hung in the air as officers led her into an interview room. Joyce looked up at them with red, glassy eyes and whispered the sentence that changed everything. Richard and David, they're not just gone. I helped them. The room froze. Her confession dropped like a stone. She spoke slowly, carefully, giving investigators just enough detail to alarm them, but not enough to understand the full picture. Yes, she had passed along small items. Yes, she had been manipulated. Yes, things had gone too far. But she insisted she didn't know where they went. Outside the prison walls, the entire state was already on alert. Roadblocks went up. Helicopters swept tree lines. Officers combed forests and neighborhoods, warning residents to lock their doors. 2 inmates were out there somewhere. Dangerous. Desperate. And they had at least a 7-hour head start. Detective Monroe closed her notebook, staring at Joyce through the observation glass. There was something missing from this story, something crucial, something Joyce wasn't saying. And when investigators opened a sealed maintenance hatch 2 hours later, they found exactly the detail that would turn the entire case upside down. The sealed maintenance hatch groaned as officers forced it open. A cold draft rushed upward, carrying the smell of dust, metal, and something far more unsettling, freedom. The beam of Detective Sarah Monroe's flashlight swept across the narrow shaft, revealing a crude ladder leading down into the dark, twisting guts beneath Clinton Correctional Facility. "They planned every inch of this," she whispered. The path was astonishing. Hand-cut openings. Chalk marks left for navigation. A trail of improvised lights wired into old circuits. The deeper the investigators went, the stronger one truth became. This wasn't a spontaneous escape. This was a blueprint. And someone had drawn it with precision. When the team finally emerged from the final pipe, they found themselves staring at a street-level manhole cover, pushed open from below. Matt and Sweat had crawled out into the quiet night, walked into town, and vanished. By the time officials realized this, the story had spread across New York. News vans parked on corners. Reporters battled for updates. Residents were on edge, locking doors for the first time in years. A full-blown manhunt was underway. Hundreds of officers from state police, tactical units, and federal agencies moved in. Drones scanned tree lines. K-9 units traced faint scents through dense woods. Helicopters thundered over the Adirondacks day and night. Every lead sent officers sprinting to new locations. But the escapees were always one step ahead. Then came the part that investigators had feared. Proof that Joyce Mitchell wasn't the only one involved. Inside her car, detectives found maps, receipts, and a list of items she had purchased over the past month. Things that seemed harmless at first glance, until they pieced the timeline together. Flashlights. Food. Basic supplies. She admitted it under questioning. She was supposed to pick both men up the night they escaped. A detail that made the entire situation even more dangerous. But she didn't show up. Joyce's voice trembled as she explained why. Panic. Fear. Second thoughts. She had returned home and suffered what she described as a breakdown, unable to complete her part of the plan. So Matt and Sweat were forced to continue the escape alone, fleeing into the wilderness without transportation or reliable shelter. Detective Monroe studied Joyce's behavior closely. Something felt off. Joyce talked about being manipulated, pressured, overwhelmed. She said Matt had been charismatic, controlling, someone who knew exactly how to pull emotional strings. But there was one more detail Joyce avoided, her eyes drifting anywhere but toward the investigators. Evidence suggested she had grown emotionally attached to one or both men, an attachment that clouded her judgment, bent her morals, and drove her to choices she never imagined making. Investigators pushed. Gently, firmly, professionally. Joyce broke down again, admitting she had been drawn in by attention she wasn't getting at home, by compliments from men who saw her vulnerabilities, and by a fantasy of escape, something she now understood had never been real. "They used me," she said quietly. "I see that now." But clarity wouldn't stop the manhunt. Days passed. The search area expanded. Officers found a trail of abandoned campsites, footprints, and small clues confirming the escapees were still moving, still surviving. Yet the pressure mounted. Exhaustion set in. And as tensions rose among search teams, investigators uncovered something that shifted the focus again. Matt and Sweat weren't just hiding. They were heading somewhere with purpose. Maps taken from Sweat's cell pointed toward a distant cabin region, far from civilization. A place isolated enough to hide for days, maybe weeks. A place where they could regroup, gather resources, or attempt a final push toward the Canadian border. It meant the manhunt was no longer a search. It was a race. And on the morning of the 9th day, just when officers began to lose momentum, a hunter in a nearby town reported something that sent chills through the command center. He had found a torn shirt, footprints, and the remains of a crude campfire, less than an hour old. Matt and Sweat were close. Very close. And they were becoming more desperate. The manhunt was about to reach its breaking point. The forest was unnervingly silent that morning, the kind of silence that makes every snap of a twig feel like a warning. Officers moved with measured steps, eyes sharp, radios low. After 9 days of dead ends, wind-blown tracks, and false sightings, the fresh trail changed everything. Detective Sarah Monroe studied the ground. Broken branches. Boot prints. A makeshift windbreak of branches that still held body heat when her hand hovered over it. They weren't hours behind the escapees now, they were minutes. "Keep your distance," she whispered to the nearest officer. "Corner them. Don't push them into doing something reckless." But desperation has a way of twisting every decision. Deeper in the woods, Richard, Matt, and David Sweat moved quickly but unevenly. Sweat checked the map constantly, tracing routes toward the northern border. Matt, on the other hand, looked restless, eyes darting, breaths short. Their plan had collapsed the moment Joyce Mitchell didn't show up, and neither man had fully recovered from that shock. Sweat felt it. Matt wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was tired, frustrated, and losing the discipline that had shaped their escape. They climbed a ridge, unaware that officers had quietly formed a half-circle behind them. The manhunt had shifted from trails to strategy, and the forest itself seemed to tighten around the two men. At the top of the hill, Matt stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Sweat nodded. Not a sound. Not a breeze. Just the heavy feeling of being watched. "Keep moving," Sweat urged. "Borders close." But Matt didn't move. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the trees. "We're not making it to the border," he said quietly. "You know that." Sweat didn't answer, because he did know. The manhunt was too large, too coordinated. Every road north was blocked. Every village was on alert. They had survived for days, but the forest was closing in. Matt turned to him. "If they catch us alive, everything falls apart." Sweat froze. There was something unsettling in Matt's tone, not violent, but resigned, like he was preparing for an ending Sweat wasn't ready for. Before Sweat could respond, branches cracked behind them. "State police," a voice shouted. "Don't move." Officers emerged from the trees, surrounding the ridge. The tension was immediate, cautious, controlled, but charged. Matt's posture shifted. Sweat saw it and stepped forward quickly. "Don't," Sweat whispered. "This doesn't help either of us." But Matt was no longer listening. He stepped toward the tree line, raising his hands only slightly. Officers called out commands, clear, professional, measured. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Sweat didn't move. He stayed still, hands visible, breathing shallow. But Matt acted on impulse. An officer made a split-second decision, one that ended the standoff and brought the chase to a close. Matt was apprehended safely, but the shockwave through the forest was immediate. Sweat, startled and afraid the same would happen to him, bolted downhill in a burst of pure instinct. The chase that followed cut through underbrush and rocky ground, officers in pursuit, Sweat pushing his body to the limit. He didn't get far. Within minutes, he was safely captured, the manhunt finally over. The forest exhaled. And so did the nation. When investigators searched Matt and Sweat's abandoned campsites, they uncovered journals, notes, and rough sketches of possible routes. No grand conspiracy. No second escape team. No hidden accomplices waiting across the border. Just two inmates who believed they could outrun a world that never stopped closing in. For weeks afterward, questions swirled around Clinton Correctional Facility, how two men could manipulate a system, how a trusted employee could be drawn into their orbit, and how vulnerabilities inside the prison had gone unnoticed for so long. But the most haunting part? Investigators discovered one final detail. Matt and Sweat had created an alternate escape route, one even Joyce Mitchell didn't know about. A route they never got to use. If they had followed it, they would have emerged miles away from where authorities were searching. A 5-degree difference in Sweat's chalk markings had changed the entire story. The escape that stunned America came down to a simple miscalculation. A mistake so small it could have been erased with one swipe of a hand. A mistake that ended a plan years in the making. And a mistake that reminded investigators of a chilling truth. Even a perfect escape can collapse in the space of a moment. If this story shook you, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.